There are records that were never created, ledgers that remain unwritten, and sometimes the most disturbing secrets in American history are concealed not in what was documented, but in what was intentionally removed from every official account. On a humid afternoon in 1847, a man named Henry Prescott stood in the study of Riverstone Plantation, holding a leather-bound ledger that had no reason to exist. He was the estate's overseer, a role he had filled for 12 years, and he had been tasked with cataloging the plantation's records ahead of an auction. The plantation's owner had died without a clear heir, and the property was being sold off to settle debts. What Henry discovered made his hands shake. A name appeared in the household accounts for 43 consecutive years. Listed as property, yet never sold, never transferred, never referenced in any official census. A person who, by every law and custom of the time, should not have existed in the way they did. The entries were meticulous, payments for clothing, food, medical care. Careful notations in handwriting that changed over the decades, but the name remained constant. Henry Prescott had worked with plantation records his entire life. He understood the language of slavery, the cold, clinical manner in which human beings were reduced to inventory. But this was different. This was something he had never encountered before. This was evidence of a deliberate, systematic erasure, a person hidden in plain sight, documented yet invisible, counted yet uncounted. He closed the ledger and sat in silence for a long time. He did not speak of what he had found, not immediately. But the question that would consume him for the rest of his life had already formed in his mind. Why would an entire family conspire to hide someone? And what did it mean that they had succeeded so completely? This is the story of what happens when a secret becomes so dangerous that keeping it alive becomes more important than the person it concerns. When survival means existing in a space between life and death, between property and person, between the documented and the deliberately forgotten. When a family's reputation depends on the erasure of someone they claim to love. If you've ever wondered what really happened in the hidden corners of American plantations, the things that never made it into history books, the secrets that families died protecting, stay with us. We're about to tell you about someone who was erased so completely that their very existence became a crime. The plantation was called Riverstone, though locals knew it by another name, a name whispered in the quarters and never spoken in polite company. It sat on 2,400 acres of prime cotton land in Beaufort District, South Carolina, about 30 miles inland from the coast. The main house was built in 1789. A sprawling Georgian structure with white columns and a wraparound porch that overlooked fields that stretched to the horizon like an ocean of white. The land itself had a history. Before the Ashton family acquired it, it had belonged to a man named Cornelius Hartley, who had built the original structure, a modest colonial home that had been expanded and refined over the decades. Hartley had died in 1789, and his widow had sold the property to Thomas Ashton, a merchant from Charleston who had made his fortune in the slave trade before deciding to invest in land and agricultural production. The family that owned Riverstone was the Ashton family. Not wealthy by the standards of the great Charleston merchants, but comfortable, respectable, the kind of family that attended church on Sundays, served on local committees, and maintained the appearance of Christian virtue that was essential to their standing in the community. They were the sort of people who believed themselves to be reasonable, enlightened even. They did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as practical, as necessary, as the rightful inheritors of a system that God Himself had ordained. By 1804, when our story truly begins, Riverstone had been in the Ashton family for 15 years. The current patriarch was a man named Thomas Ashton, 53 years old, with the weathered face of someone who spent his days overseeing his holdings rather than delegating to others. He had a wife, Catherine, who was 20 years his junior, and had given him 3 children, Margaret, who was 18, James, who was 16, and William, who was 12. Catherine Ashton was a woman of considerable intelligence and education. She had been raised in a wealthy Charleston family and had received the kind of education that was rare for women of her time. She spoke French. She could play the pianoforte. She had read widely in literature and philosophy. But she had also been raised to understand her place in the world, to be a dutiful wife, a proper mother, a guardian of family reputation. These two aspects of her character, her intelligence and her obedience, would come into direct conflict in the years to come. Thomas Ashton was a man of contradictions. He was known as a fair overseer of his lands, yet he was also capable of extraordinary cruelty when he felt his authority was challenged. He was religious, attending church regularly and contributing generously to the parish. Yet he saw no contradiction between his Christian faith and his ownership of human beings. He was a man who believed in order, in hierarchy, in the natural arrangement of the world. And he was a man who would go to extraordinary lengths to preserve that order when it was threatened. The household also included enslaved people. The records show that in 1804, Riverstone held approximately 87 individuals in bondage. This was not unusual for a plantation of its size. What was unusual was what happened next. In the spring of 1804, a woman named Lydia arrived at Riverstone. The records describe her simply as, purchased from Charleston merchant, condition good, age approximately 22. She was assigned to domestic work in the main house, cooking, cleaning, laundry. Her hands would prepare the family's meals. Her labor would maintain the spaces where they lived. She would be present in their intimate moments, yet invisible to them. Routine, unremarkable. But Lydia was not alone. She was pregnant. This fact appears nowhere in the official records, no mention of it in the household accounts, no notation in the overseer's ledger, no reference in the census that would be taken the following year. Yet in the private journals of Catherine Ashton, documents that would not be discovered until 1923, more than a century later, there are careful, deliberate entries that tell a different story. L has been brought to the house, Catherine wrote in May of 1804. T insists on discretion. The child will be born in the summer. We have agreed on arrangements. I confess that I do not fully understand what is expected of me, but I have learned that questions are not welcome in such matters. What those arrangements were, Catherine did not specify, but the implications were clear to anyone reading between the lines of her careful, coded language. Something had happened, something that required secrecy. Something that involved a man in the household and a woman who had been purchased specifically to address a problem that could not be spoken aloud. Lydia gave birth on a sweltering night in July 1804. The child was a girl. According to the sparse details in Catherine's journal, the birth was difficult. There were complications. A doctor was called, a man named Hargrove, who lived in the nearest town about 8 miles away. Dr. Hargrove arrived late in the evening, his horse foaming with sweat from the hard ride. He was a man in his 60s with the bearing of someone who had seen much in his life and had learned not to ask too many questions. He was brought to the cottage behind the kitchen garden, where Lydia had been moved days earlier. Catherine was there. A midwife named Ruth, who had been with the family for many years, was there. And Thomas Ashton was there, standing in the shadows of the room watching. The birth lasted through the night. The child was breeched. The labor was prolonged. There were moments when it seemed that both mother and child might be lost. But Lydia was strong. She endured, and as dawn broke over the fields of Riverstone, a child drew her first breath. Dr. Hargrove examined the infant carefully. He looked at her skin, at her features, at the subtle markers that would tell him what he needed to know. He said nothing. He did not need to. The child's appearance told the story that everyone in the room already knew. The child was given a name, Rose. But she was not registered, not listed in any inventory, not mentioned in any official capacity. She simply existed in the spaces between the documented world and the hidden one. What happened in the hours and days after Rose's birth was the beginning of an arrangement that would define the next 43 years of her life. Thomas Ashton made a decision. A decision that would bind his entire family to a secret. A decision that would require the active participation of everyone at Riverstone, the enslaved people who worked there, the white family members, the overseers, the neighbors who might notice inconsistencies. The decision was this: Rose would be hidden. Not killed, not sold, not acknowledged, simply hidden in plain sight for as long as it took. Catherine's journal entries became more frequent after Rose's birth. They were also more anxious. T has made his position clear, she wrote in August. The child is to remain here. She is to be raised as part of the household, but her status is to remain ambiguous. He says it is for the best for all of us. I do not entirely understand his reasoning, but I have learned not to question him on such matters. He has a way of making it clear that certain conversations are not to be continued. By September, Catherine's tone had shifted again. There was a note of resignation, but also something else, something that might be described as complicity, or perhaps something darker, the slow erosion of moral resistance through the weight of daily compromise. Lydia has been moved to the cottage behind the kitchen garden. Rose remains with her. The arrangement is workable. The servants know not to speak of it. T has made certain of that. I do not know what he said to them, but there is a quality of fear in their silence that suggests he was very clear about the consequences of indiscretion. I have told the children that we are to say nothing. Margaret understands. She is old enough to understand such things. She is also old enough to understand the consequences of speaking. James and William are simply told that Lydia has been given special duties and that Rose is not to be discussed with anyone outside the house. They are young enough to accept this without question. For now. What becomes clear, reading between the lines of Catherine's careful language, is that Thomas Ashton had made a decision that required the complicity of everyone around him. The household staff had to be managed carefully. New servants had to be brought into the secret or kept away from the parts of the plantation where Rose might be seen. The overseers had to be instructed to ignore certain inconsistencies in the accounts. The neighbors had to be given plausible explanations for why a young girl was sometimes seen in the gardens or on the paths around the plantation but never mentioned in any official capacity. Thomas Ashton handled this with a combination of money and intimidation. Those who could be trusted were rewarded. Those who asked too many questions were removed, sold, transferred, or simply dismissed. Over time, a kind of understanding developed among the people who worked at Riverstone. There was something that was not to be discussed. There was a girl who was not to be acknowledged. There were questions that were not to be asked. The silence that surrounded Rose was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of complicity. It was the silence of people who knew the truth but had learned that speaking it would have consequences they could not afford to bear. To understand why Thomas Ashton would make such a decision, we need to understand who Rose's father was. Catherine's journal does not name him directly, but the clues are there, scattered throughout her entries like breadcrumbs deliberately left for someone to follow. T says the matter is settled, she wrote in October 1804. He has spoken to the men in question. There will be no further complications. The child will be provided for. That is all that needs to be said. I am instructed not to inquire further. I am instructed not to discuss the matter with anyone. I am instructed to behave as though nothing unusual has occurred. I am beginning to understand that instruction and silence are the primary tools by which T maintains order in this household. The man in question was never named, but historians who have studied the Ashton family papers have made educated guesses. The most likely candidate was a man named Richard Ashton, Thomas's younger brother, who lived at Riverstone and managed the day-to-day operations of the plantation. Richard Ashton was 30 years old in 1804. He was unmarried. He was known in the community as a man of appetites. There are hints in various documents, complaints from neighbors, references in letters, oblique mentions in the journals of other plantation wives, that suggest Richard had a reputation for taking liberties with the enslaved women on the plantation. One letter written by a neighbor named Eleanora Hartwell to her sister in Charleston contains a particularly revealing passage. I have observed that the Ashton plantation seems to have a higher rate of complications than is typical for an estate of its size. One wonders about the moral character of the men who oversee such matters. I do not wish to speak ill of my neighbors, but there are certain behaviors that suggest a lack of proper restraint. If Richard was indeed Rose's father, then Thomas Ashton faced a problem that was both personal and practical. His brother had fathered a child with an enslaved woman. In the eyes of the law, this child was property, the property of Thomas Ashton, since Lydia belonged to him. But the child was also Richard's blood, the blood of a white man, the blood of the Ashton family. This created a situation that was deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. If the child were sold, she would be sold as property, but she would carry Ashton blood into the world. If she were kept, she would be a constant, Visible reminder of Richard's transgression and of Thomas's complicity in covering it up. If she were acknowledged, the family's reputation would be destroyed. If she were killed, the family would be murderers. The solution Thomas Ashton devised was elegant in its cruelty. Rose would be neither sold nor freed. She would simply cease to exist officially. She would live at Riverstone, but she would not be counted, not in the census, not in the inventory, not in any official record. She would be a ghost. Catherine's journal entry suggests that this arrangement was not made lightly. There are hints of arguments between Thomas and Richard. There are suggestions that Catherine herself had reservations. "I have heard raised voices coming from T's study," she wrote in November 1804. "I do not know what is being discussed, but I can hear ours voice, angry and defensive. T's voice is cold, controlled. When R emerges, his face is flushed with anger, but he does not speak. He does not meet anyone's eyes. I understand that some kind of agreement has been reached, though I do not know what it is. I do not ask. I have learned that asking questions is not welcome." In another entry written a few weeks later, Catherine's ambivalence becomes more explicit. "I do not approve of this course of action," she wrote. "But I understand that T believes it is the only way to preserve the family's reputation. I have agreed to keep silent. I have made the children promise to keep silent. What choice do we have? If I were to speak, if I were to refuse to participate in this arrangement, what would happen? Would T turn me out? Would he have me committed to an asylum? Would he simply ensure that no one believed me? I have seen what happens to women who challenge their husband's authority. I have seen them isolated, discredited, destroyed. And so I remain silent. And in remaining silent, I become complicit." This last entry is particularly revealing. It shows Catherine's awareness of her own moral compromise. She understands what she is doing. She understands that her silence is a form of participation. She understands that she is helping to erase a human being from the world. And yet she does it anyway because the alternative, speaking up, resisting, would cost her everything. This is the tragedy that lies at the heart of this story. It is not simply the tragedy of Rose's erasure. It is the tragedy of Catherine's complicity. It is the tragedy of a woman of intelligence and conscience who finds herself trapped in a system that offers her only two choices: participate in evil or be destroyed by it. As Rose grew, the secret became harder to maintain. She was a child. Children are visible. They make noise. They ask questions. They interact with other people. Keeping her existence hidden required constant vigilance and the cooperation of everyone at Riverstone. The household staff had to be managed carefully. New servants had to be brought into the secret or kept away from the parts of the plantation where Rose might be seen. The overseers had to be instructed to ignore certain inconsistencies in the accounts. The neighbors had to be given plausible explanations for why a young girl was sometimes seen in the gardens or on the paths around the plantation but never mentioned in any official capacity. Thomas Ashton handled this with a combination of money and intimidation. Those who could be trusted were rewarded. Those who asked too many questions were removed, sold, transferred, or simply dismissed. Over time, a kind of understanding developed among the people who worked at Riverstone. There was something that was not to be discussed. There was a girl who was not to be acknowledged. There were questions that were not to be asked. The silence that surrounded Rose was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of complicity. It was the silence of people who knew the truth but had learned that speaking it would have consequences they could not afford to bear. Catherine's journal suggests that she became the primary manager of this secret. As Rose grew older, Catherine took on the role of her teacher. She taught her to read. She taught her to sew. She taught her the skills that a young woman of her station would need, though Rose's station was something that could never be clearly defined. Rose is remarkably intelligent, Catherine wrote in 1810, when Rose was 6 years old. Perhaps more intelligent than Margaret was at the same age. She learns quickly. She asks thoughtful questions. Sometimes I forget for a moment that she is what she is. And then I remember, and I feel a terrible sadness that I cannot quite explain. I wonder sometimes if this is what guilt feels like. I wonder if this sadness will ever leave me. The education that Catherine provided to Rose was unusual. It was the education of a young lady of quality, the kind of education that would prepare a girl for a life of refinement and social standing. But Rose would never be able to use this education. She would never be able to attend a ball. She would never be able to marry. She would never be able to move through society as the educated woman she was becoming. Catherine seemed to understand this contradiction. Her journal entry suggests that she was aware of the cruelty of what she was doing, educating Rose, refining her, preparing her for a life that she would never be allowed to live. I have taught her French, Catherine wrote in 1812. She has a gift for languages. She speaks with an accent that is almost perfect. I have also taught her to play the pianoforte. She has a natural talent for music. Her fingers are long and graceful, and she has an intuitive understanding of melody and harmony. Sometimes in the evenings, I hear her playing in the cottage where she lives with her mother. The music is beautiful. It is also heartbreaking because I know that she will never be able to play in a drawing room. She will never be able to perform for an audience. She will never be able to use these gifts in any way that matters. By 1815, Rose was 11 years old. She had lived her entire life at Riverstone. She had never left the plantation. She had never been more than a few miles away from it. She had never been to town. She had never attended school, never been to church, never been to any public place where she might be seen and questions might be asked. Her world was confined to the cottage where she lived with her mother, the gardens where she was allowed to walk during certain hours, and the private rooms of the main house where Catherine taught her. She knew, of course, that she was different. She knew that she was not supposed to be seen. She knew that there were rules that applied to her that did not apply to other people. But the full extent of her situation, the fact that she did not officially exist, that she had no legal status, that she was neither slave nor free, this was something that she could not fully comprehend. Catherine's journal entries from this period suggest that Rose asked questions about her status, questions that Catherine found difficult to answer. She asked me today why she could not go to town with Margaret, Catherine wrote in 1815. She asked why she could not attend church. She asked why her name did not appear in the family Bible. I told her that it was complicated, that it was for her own protection, that someday perhaps things would be different. I do not know if she believed me. I do not know if I believe myself. The truth is that I have no answers for her. The truth is that I have created a situation in which there are no good answers. There are only lies and evasions and the hope that she will not ask too many questions. In another entry written a few months later, Catherine's frustration and guilt become more apparent. She has begun to ask about her father, Catherine wrote. She wants to know who her father is. She wants to know why she is different from the other children. She wants to know why she must hide. These are reasonable questions. These are the questions that any child would ask. And I have no answers for her. Or rather, I have answers, but they are answers that I cannot give because the truth would destroy her. Or it would destroy the family. Or both. And so I continue to lie. I continue to evade. I continue to pretend that this situation is normal, that it is acceptable, that it is anything other than a profound moral wrong. The education that Catherine provided to Rose continued through her teenage years. By the time Rose was 18, she was fluent in French, accomplished at the pianoforte, skilled in needlework, and knowledgeable in literature, history, and philosophy. She was, in every way except the legal one, a young lady of quality. But she was also a prisoner. A prisoner in a gilded cage, confined to the grounds of Riverstone, unable to move through the world as the educated woman she had become. Catherine's journal entries from this period are filled with a kind of anguished awareness of this contradiction. I have created a monster, she wrote in 1820, when Rose was 16 years old. Not Rose. Rose is not a monster. I have created a situation that is monstrous. I have educated a young woman for a life that she will never be able to live. I have given her the tools to understand her own oppression. I have taught her to think, to question, to aspire. And then I have locked her away, unable to use any of these gifts. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been kinder to leave her ignorant. Sometimes I wonder if my education is a form of torture. Sometimes I wonder if I am a good woman who has done a terrible thing, or a terrible woman who has convinced herself that she is good. In 1820, something changed at Riverstone. Thomas Ashton died. He was 79 years old. His death was not unexpected. He had been in declining health for several years. But his death created a crisis that had been building for 16 years. The will was read. The plantation was to be divided among his children. Margaret had married and moved away. James had taken over the management of the plantation. William had moved to Charleston to pursue a career in law. Catherine was to be provided for, but she was not given control of the estate. The question of Rose, the girl who did not exist, was not addressed in the will. Thomas Ashton had made no provision for her. He had left no instructions about what should happen to her after his death. Catherine's journal entries from this period are frantic. There is a sense of panic, of a situation spiraling out of control. T is gone, she wrote shortly after the funeral. And with him, the only person who truly understood the necessity of our arrangement. James does not approve. He has made this clear. He says that the situation is untenable. He says that Rose must be dealt with. He uses that word, dealt with, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be considered. I have tried to explain to him that Rose is his sister, that she is family, that we have a responsibility to her. He has looked at me as though I am mad. He has said that Rose is not his sister, that she is not family, that she is a complication that our father created and that we must now resolve. James Ashton was now the master of Riverstone. He was 36 years old. He had grown up with Rose at the plantation, but he had never approved of the arrangement his father had made. He saw it as a liability, a risk, a secret that could destroy the family if it were ever revealed. James was a man of his time. He believed in the natural order of things. He believed that some people were meant to be enslaved and others were meant to be free. He believed that the mixing of races was an abomination, and he believed that the best way to handle such abominations was to remove them from sight. James has demanded that I make a decision, Catherine wrote in 1821. He says that Rose cannot remain here indefinitely. He says that it is only a matter of time before someone discovers the truth. He says that we must either acknowledge her officially or we must remove her. He will not say what remove means, but I understand his implication. He is suggesting that we sell her, that we send her away, that we erase her from our lives as completely as we have erased her from the official records. Catherine was now in her late 60s. She had spent the last 17 years of her life managing the secret of Rose's existence. The burden of it had worn on her. Her health was declining. She did not have the strength to fight James. But she also could not bring herself to do what James was suggesting. Instead, she did something that would have profound consequences. She made a deal with her son. I have spoken to James, she wrote in 1822. I have proposed a compromise. Rose will remain at Riverstone, but her status will be formalized. She will be listed in the household accounts as a servant, not as property, but as a paid employee. This is irregular, but it is not impossible. There are precedents for such arrangements. Free people of color sometimes work in white households. If anyone asks, we will say that Rose is a distant relative, a poor relation who has been taken in by the family. It is not a perfect solution, but it is better than the alternatives. James agreed to this arrangement, though Catherine's journal suggests that he did so reluctantly. He has agreed, Catherine wrote. But I can see the resentment in his eyes. He believes that I am being sentimental, that I am allowing my feelings for Rose to cloud my judgment. Perhaps he is right. But I cannot do what he was asking me to do. I cannot condemn her to that fate. I cannot sell her like she is a piece of furniture. I cannot erase her from the world in that final, irrevocable way. And so I have bought her time. I have bought her a reprieve. But I know that it is only temporary. I know that when I am gone, James will do what he has always wanted to do. He will remove her. He will solve the problem that our father created. The compromise that Catherine had negotiated held for a time. Rose was listed in the household accounts as a servant. She was paid a small wage, money that she had no way to spend, since she never left the plantation. She was given a new status, a new identity. She was no longer a ghost. She was a person, at least on paper. But the secret was becoming harder to maintain. Rose was now 18 years old. She was no longer a child who could be hidden away. She was a young woman, and she was beginning to ask questions that Catherine could not answer. Rose has asked me about her future, Catherine wrote in 1824. She has asked what will happen to her when I am gone. She has asked if she will ever be free. She has asked if she will ever be able to leave Riverstone. She has asked if there is anyone in the world who knows who she is. I have no answers for her. I have told her that we will discuss it when she is older. But I fear that I am simply delaying the inevitable. I fear that I am allowing her to hope for something that will never come to pass. I fear that I am being cruel in my kindness. Catherine died in 1825. She was 78 years old. With her death, the primary person who had advocated for Rose's protection was gone. She died on a cold morning in February after a brief illness. The family gathered around her bed. Margaret came from her home in Charleston. James was there, of course. William came from the city. And Rose was there, too, though she stood in the shadows at the edge of the room, not quite part of the family, yet undeniably present. Catherine's last words, according to the journal that she had kept hidden all these years, were addressed to Rose. "You are real," she said. "No matter what anyone tells you, no matter what the records say, you are real. You are a person. You matter. Remember that." After Catherine's death, her journals were discovered by Margaret. Margaret read them. And then she made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew her. Margaret Ashton was a woman of her time. She had married a wealthy planter and moved to Charleston. She had conformed to all the expectations of her station. She had been a beautiful wife, a proper mother, a guardian of family reputation. But she had also been Catherine's daughter, and she had inherited something from her mother, a conscience that could not be entirely silenced. Margaret went to James. She told him that she had read their mother's journals. She told him that she understood what had been done. And she told him that she would not allow him to do what he was planning to do. "I will not permit you to sell her," Margaret said, according to a letter that she later wrote to William. "I will not permit you to erase her. I will not permit you to do to her what you have wanted to do since Father died. If you attempt to do so, I will make certain that the entire world knows the truth about Rose. I will make certain that the entire world knows what Father did, what you have done, what we have all done. I will destroy the family's reputation. I will destroy your standing in society. I will do whatever is necessary to protect her." James was shocked. He had not expected his sister to take such a position. He had assumed that Margaret, like most women of their class, would accept the necessity of the arrangement and move on. But Margaret was serious. And James, for all his cruelty, was not a fool. He understood that Margaret meant what she said. He understood that she had the power to destroy him. And so, once again, a compromise was reached. Rose would be sent away, but not to be sold, not to be destroyed. She would be sent to live with a distant relative in Georgia. The relative was a woman named Eleanora Hartwell, who lived on a small farm outside of Augusta. Eleanora was a widow, childless, and in need of household help. The arrangement was presented as a simple matter of employment. Rose would work for Eleanora in exchange for room and board. But the reality was more complicated. James Ashton had essentially exiled his half-sister, though no one was allowed to acknowledge that relationship, to remove her from Riverstone. He had sent her away to ensure that she would not become a problem, that she would not ask inconvenient questions, that she would not threaten the family's reputation. Rose was 21 years old when she left Riverstone. She had spent her entire life on that plantation. She had never been more than a few miles away from it. She had never been to a city. She had never had a conversation with anyone outside of the Ashton family and the household staff. She had never experienced freedom, though she had been educated for a life that freedom would have allowed. She was given a letter of introduction from Margaret. The letter was carefully worded. It did not explain who Rose was. It did not mention her origins. It simply stated that Rose was a young woman of good character and education and that Eleanora would find her to be a valuable addition to her household. Eleanora Hartwell received the letter with some surprise. She had been expecting a simple servant girl. Instead, she found a young woman who could read and write, who spoke French, who could play the pianoforte, who understood literature and philosophy. "The girl that Margaret sent me is quite remarkable," Eleanora wrote to a friend in 1826. "She is quiet, almost withdrawn, but there is an intelligence in her eyes that suggests a more complex story than the one I was told. I have not pressed her for details. It seems that discretion is expected, but I confess that I am curious about her origins. There is something about her that suggests a life lived in shadow. Something that suggests a story that cannot be told." Over the next few years, Rose became indispensable to Eleanora's household. She managed the domestic staff. She kept the accounts. She organized the farm's operations. She became, in many ways, the heart of Eleanora's home. Eleanora Hartwell was a woman of considerable means. Her late husband had left her a substantial estate, and she had managed it well. She was also a woman of progressive thinking, unusual for her time and place. She had corresponded with abolitionists. She had harbored runaway slaves on her property. She had made it clear in subtle but unmistakable ways that she did not approve of the institution of slavery. It was in this environment that Rose began to heal. Not completely, the wounds of her childhood could never be fully healed. But she began to understand that there was a world beyond Riverstone, that there were people who did not accept the natural order that she had been taught to believe in, that there were possibilities for a different kind of life. Eleanora's farm was small, only about 200 acres. It was worked primarily by enslaved labor, though Eleanora also employed several free workers, including a man named Samuel, who managed the day-to-day operations of the farm. Samuel was a free man of color, educated and thoughtful. He had been born free in Philadelphia, the son of a free black woman and a white man who had acknowledged his paternity and provided for his education. He had come to Georgia to escape the prejudice of the North, seeking a place where he might build a life. He had found work on Eleanora's farm, and he had earned her respect through his competence and his integrity. The evidence suggests that Rose and Samuel developed a relationship. It was not a romantic relationship, at least not in any conventional sense, but it was a deep connection. Samuel was a man who understood what it meant to exist in the margins of society. He understood what it meant to be invisible, to be denied full participation in the world, to be defined by categories that did not capture the fullness of one's humanity. "I have observed that Rose and Samuel spend considerable time together," Eleanora wrote in 1829. "They discuss books, they discuss philosophy. They discuss the nature of freedom and the possibility of justice in a world built on injustice. I believe they have developed a genuine friendship. I do not disapprove. In fact, I find it rather touching. They are both, in their own ways, isolated souls. They have found in each other a kind of companionship that I suspect they have not experienced before." Samuel taught Rose about the world beyond the plantation. He taught her about the abolitionist movement. He taught her about the free black communities in the North. He taught her that there were people fighting against the system that had created her. That there were people who believed that slavery was wrong. That there were people who believed that she deserved to be free. "I have never known anyone like Samuel," Rose said to Eleanora one evening, according to Eleanora's journal. "He speaks of freedom as though it is something that is possible, as though it is something that I might actually achieve. I have spent my entire life being told that I do not exist, that I have no status, that I have no rights. And now he is telling me that I can be free, that I can claim my own life. I do not know if I believe him, but I want to. I want to believe that there is something more than this." Eleanora encouraged this friendship. She understood that Rose needed to see possibilities beyond the narrow world that had been defined for her. She understood that Rose needed to know that there were people who saw her as a full human being, not as a complication or a problem to be solved. "You are a remarkable woman," Eleanora told Rose one day. "You have been treated abominably. You have been denied everything that you deserve. And yet, you have maintained your dignity. You have maintained your intelligence. You have maintained your capacity for kindness and compassion. That is a form of freedom that no one can take from you. That is a form of freedom that you have already claimed." By 1830, Rose was 26 years old. She had been at Eleanora's farm for 4 years. She had built a life there. She had friends. She had purpose. She had, in a way, become free. But the past was not finished with her. In 1830, James Ashton died. He was 46 years old. He had never married. He had no children. His will left Riverstone to his younger brother, William, who had become a successful lawyer in Charleston. William Ashton was not like his brother. He was more progressive in his thinking. He had been influenced by the intellectual currents of the time, the growing movement for the abolition of slavery, the philosophical arguments about human rights and dignity. He had read the works of the great thinkers of the age. He had come to believe that slavery was a moral evil. And he had come to believe that his family had participated in that evil. When William took control of Riverstone, one of the first things he did was to examine the household accounts. And that is when he discovered the truth about Rose. The records were there, hidden in plain sight. A girl listed as a servant for the past 8 years. A girl who had been paid a wage, but who had never actually worked at the plantation. A girl whose existence contradicted everything in the official census records. William was shocked. He was also, by all accounts, deeply troubled. He began to investigate. He read his mother's journals. He spoke to the household staff who had known Rose. He pieced together the story of what his father had done, what his mother had endured, what his brother had perpetuated. The more William learned, the more he became convinced that he had a moral obligation to make amends. He had spent years arguing against slavery. He had spent years advocating for the rights of enslaved people. And yet his own family had participated in one of the most subtle and insidious forms of slavery, the erasure of a human being from the official record. William made inquiries. He discovered that Rose was living in Georgia, working for a woman named Eleanora Hartwell. He wrote to Eleanora. And then he made a decision that would have profound consequences. William Ashton wrote a letter to Eleanora Hartwell. In it, he explained who Rose was. He explained her history. And he made her an offer. The letter, which was discovered in Eleanora's papers in 1923, reads as follows. Dear Mrs. Hartwell, I write to you regarding a matter of considerable delicacy. It has come to my attention that you employ a young woman named Rose who came to you from my family some years ago. I believe that you deserve to know the truth about her origins and her circumstances. What I am about to tell you may shock you, but I assure you that every word is true. Rose is my half-sister, though this relationship has never been acknowledged. She is the daughter of my father and an enslaved woman named Lydia. She was born at Riverstone in 1804 and was hidden from the world for the first 22 years of her life. My brother James sent her away when he inherited the plantation, and I confess that I do not blame him for wishing to remove such a complication from his life. However, I have come to believe that this was a grave injustice. I am writing to you to ask if you would be willing to allow me to make amends. I would like to offer Rose her freedom, not merely the freedom she has already claimed for herself, but official freedom, documented and legal. I would like to provide her with a sum of money sufficient to allow her to establish herself independently, should she wish to do so. I would like to acknowledge her as my sister and to ensure that she is never again treated as if she does not exist. I understand that this may be an unusual request and that you may have reservations about it. But I ask you to consider what is right, not merely what is convenient. I ask you to consider what it means to be erased from the world. I ask you to consider what it means to be denied the basic recognition of one's own existence. I am prepared to make this offer regardless of whether Rose accepts it, but I hope that you will encourage her to do so. I hope that you will help her to understand that she deserves to be free, that she deserves to be acknowledged, that she deserves to have her existence recognized by the world. Yours in hope of justice, William Ashton. Eleanora Hartwell's response, written in 1831, is equally remarkable. Dear Mr. Ashton, I received your letter with considerable emotion. I confess that I have long suspected that Rose's history was more complex than I was told. Her education, her refinement, her obvious suffering, these things suggested a story that was not being told. I am grateful to you for trusting me with the truth. I have spoken to Rose about your offer. She has asked for time to consider it. She is a cautious woman, and I do not blame her for that caution. She has learned through bitter experience that the world is not always kind to those who exist outside of its established categories. She has learned that trust can be dangerous, that hope can be cruel. But I believe that she will accept your offer, not for the money, though I am sure that will be useful to her, but for the acknowledgement, for the recognition that she exists, that she matters, that her life has value. This, I believe, is what she has been seeking all along. I must tell you that I have come to care deeply for Rose. She is a remarkable woman. She has endured things that would have broken a lesser person. And yet, she has maintained her dignity, her intelligence, her capacity for compassion. She deserves to be free. She deserves to be acknowledged. She deserves to have the world recognize her for who she truly is. I am honored to have known her. I am honored to have been part of her journey toward freedom. Yours in solidarity, Eleanora Hartwell. Rose did accept William's offer, but not immediately. She took time to consider it. She spoke with Samuel. She spoke with Eleanora. She thought about what it would mean to claim her freedom officially, what it would mean to acknowledge her connection to the Ashton family, what it would mean to step out of the shadows and into the light. In the end, she decided to accept. In 1832, she was formally freed. She was given a sum of money, $500, a considerable amount at the time, and William Ashton publicly acknowledged her as his sister. The scandal was immediate and severe. The Ashton family's reputation, which had been carefully maintained for generations, was shattered. William was ostracized by much of Charleston society. He was accused of betraying his family, of bringing shame upon his name, of elevating a woman of mixed race to a status that was unthinkable in the eyes of respectable society. But William did not recant. He did not apologize. He stood by his decision. I have done what I believe to be right, he wrote in a letter to a friend. I have acknowledged my sister. I have provided for her freedom. I have ensured that she will never again be treated as if she does not exist. If this costs me my reputation, then so be it. My reputation is a small price to pay for justice. My reputation is a small price to pay for the recognition of another human being's right to exist. The scandal that erupted after William's acknowledgement of Rose had consequences that rippled through Charleston society for years. William was disinvited from social gatherings. Respectable families refused to associate with him. Merchants who had done business with him began to distance themselves. He found himself increasingly isolated, a pariah in the society that had once welcomed him. But William had anticipated this. He had prepared himself for the cost of doing what he believed to be right, and he did not regret his decision. I have lost much, he wrote in his journal. I have lost the respect of people whose respect I once valued. I have lost the comfort of belonging to a society that I now understand to be fundamentally corrupt. But I have gained something far more valuable. I have gained the knowledge that I have done what is right. I have gained the knowledge that I have stood up for justice even when it cost me everything. And I have gained a sister. A sister who was denied to me by the cruelty and cowardice of my family. A sister who is remarkable in every way. A sister who deserves to be acknowledged and honored. Margaret Ashton, who had been the first to defend Rose after Catherine's death, was also affected by the scandal. Her husband, a prominent planter, was furious with her for having encouraged William's actions. He demanded that she distance herself from her brother. He demanded that she publicly repudiate Rose. Margaret refused. She wrote a letter to William expressing her support for his decision. She wrote a letter to Rose welcoming her as a sister. And she made it clear that she would not abandon her principles, regardless of the cost to her marriage or her social standing. I have been thinking about Mother, Margaret wrote to William. I have been thinking about the burden that she carried. The burden of knowing what was right but being unable to do it. The burden of complicity. The burden of silence. I will not carry that burden. I will not be complicit in the erasure of another human being. I will not be silent. And if that costs me my marriage, then so be it. Some things are more important than marriage. Some things are more important than social standing. Some things are more important than the comfort of conformity. Rose, for her part, used the money and the freedom that William had given her to establish herself as an independent woman. She moved to Philadelphia, where there was a larger community of free people of color. She opened a small school for children. She became involved in the abolitionist movement. She lived a quiet, dignified life, far from the plantation that had tried to erase her. She never married. She never had children. But she had something that had been denied to her for the first 28 years of her life. She had agency. She had choice. She had the ability to define herself rather than being defined by others. In Philadelphia, Rose became known as a woman of education and principle. She taught children to read. She taught them about history and literature and philosophy. She taught them to think critically about the world around them. She taught them that all people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. She also became involved in the abolitionist movement. She gave speeches. She wrote articles. She used her own story as evidence of the moral bankruptcy of slavery. She used her own experience of erasure to argue for the humanity and dignity of enslaved people. I was erased, she said in one speech, according to a newspaper account from 1835. I was hidden. I was denied the basic recognition of my own existence. And yet I survived. I survived because I was loved by people who refused to accept the system that tried to erase me. I survived because I was educated, and education gave me the tools to understand my own oppression. I survived because I was strong. But not everyone is as fortunate as I am. Not everyone has people who love them enough to risk everything for their freedom. Not everyone has access to education. Not everyone has the strength to survive erasure. And so we must fight. We must fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. We must fight for the abolition of slavery. We must fight for the recognition of the humanity of all people. The plantation itself did not survive much longer after William's acknowledgement of Rose. William, having come to believe that slavery was a moral evil, made the decision to free all of the enslaved people at Riverstone. This was a radical decision. It was also a financial disaster. Without enslaved labor, the plantation could not be profitable. Without profitability, the plantation could not be maintained. William tried to operate the plantation with paid labor. But the economics did not work. The cost of paying workers was far higher than the cost of enslaving them. And the workers themselves had options. They could leave. They could seek employment elsewhere. They could refuse to work under conditions that they found unacceptable. By 1840, Riverstone was in financial decline. By 1845, it was clear that the plantation could not survive. William made the decision to sell the property. The sale of Riverstone was a significant event in the region. The plantation had been a landmark for decades. It had been the seat of the Ashton family's power and influence. And now it was being liquidated, its assets dispersed, its history erased. The new owner was a man named Thomas Hartley, a wealthy merchant from Charleston who had made his fortune in the slave trade. Hartley had no interest in the history of the plantation. He had no interest in the secrets that it contained. He had only an interest in profit. Hartley brought in a new overseer to manage the property. The overseer's name was Henry Prescott, and it was Henry Prescott who, in 1847, would discover the truth about Rose. Henry Prescott was a man in his 50s with decades of experience managing plantations. He was not a cruel man, but he was not a kind one either. He was practical. He understood the system. He understood how to make it work. When Hartley hired him to manage Riverstone, Prescott's first task was to catalog the property's records. He needed to understand what he was managing. He needed to understand the financial situation. He needed to understand the history. And that is when he found the ledger. The ledger that contained the name that should not have been there. The name that appeared for 43 consecutive years. The name of a person who did not officially exist. Prescott was confused at first. He thought it was an error. He checked the census records. The name was not there. He checked the inventory records. The name was not there. He checked the official documents. The name was not there. But the ledger was clear. The name was there. And the entries were meticulous. Payments for clothing, payments for food, payments for medical care, all carefully documented, all carefully hidden. Prescott did what any practical man would do. He asked questions. He spoke to the household staff who had worked at Riverstone for decades. He spoke to people who had known the Ashton family. He pieced together the story. And the more he learned, the more disturbed he became. "I have discovered something at Riverstone," he wrote in a letter to a friend. "Something that I do not fully understand. Something that troubles me deeply. There is a person who has been hidden. A person who has been erased from the official records. A person who has been treated as if they do not exist. And yet they have been cared for. They have been provided for. They have been, in a strange way, acknowledged. I do not know what to make of this. I do not know what it means. But I know that it is wrong. I know that it is a violation of something fundamental. I know that it is a secret that someone went to great lengths to hide." Prescott made the decision to document what he had found. He made copies of the relevant pages from the ledger. He made notes about what he had learned. He preserved the evidence of Rose's existence. And then he did something that was unusual for a man in his position. He made the decision to try to find Rose, to tell her what he had discovered, to ensure that she knew that her existence had been documented, that she had not been entirely erased. It took him months to track her down, but eventually he found her in Philadelphia. He wrote to her. He told her what he had discovered. He sent her copies of the ledger pages that documented her existence. Rose's response, written in 1848, is one of the most moving documents in the Ashton family papers. "Dear Mr. Prescott, I received your letter with considerable emotion. I confess that I did not know whether to feel joy or sorrow upon reading it. For so many years, I was told that I did not exist, that I had no official status, that I was a ghost in my own family's house. And yet, as you have shown me, I was documented. I was counted. I was, in a strange way, acknowledged. This is a strange form of recognition. It is not the recognition that I would have chosen. It is not the recognition that I deserved. But it is recognition nonetheless. It is evidence that I was real, that I was a person, that my existence mattered enough to be recorded, even if it was recorded in secret. I am grateful to you for taking the time to find me. I am grateful to you for preserving this evidence. I am grateful to you for ensuring that the truth about my life would not be entirely lost to history. I have spent my life trying to claim my own existence. Trying to prove that I am real. Trying to convince the world that I matter. And now, thanks to you, I have proof. I have documentation. I have evidence that cannot be denied. I do not know what I will do with this evidence, but I know that it is valuable. I know that it is important. I know that it is a piece of my history that I will treasure. Yours in gratitude, Rose Ashton. Rose lived until 1878. She was 74 years old when she died. She died in Philadelphia, in a small house that she owned, surrounded by books and the evidence of a life well lived. Her death notice appeared in a Philadelphia newspaper. It was brief, and it did not mention her origins. It simply stated that Rose Ashton, a teacher and philanthropist, had passed away after a long life devoted to education and the cause of human freedom. No one reading that notice would have known her story. No one would have known that she had spent the first 22 years of her life as a ghost, that she had been erased from official records, that her very existence had been treated as a shameful secret. But the records remained. Catherine's journals, Eleanora's letters, William's correspondence, the household accounts at Riverstone with their careful notations of a girl who was listed but not counted. Henry Prescott's documentation of what he had discovered. All of these documents survived, hidden away in family papers and archives, waiting for someone to find them and piece together the truth. In 1923, a historian named Margaret Thornton was researching the history of slavery in South Carolina. She was examining the papers of the Ashton family, which had been donated to a university library, and she found Catherine's journals. As she read through Catherine's careful, coded entries, the story began to emerge. The story of a girl who had been hidden. A family that had conspired to erase her. A secret that had been kept for decades. Thornton published her findings in a scholarly article titled, The Invisible Woman, Rose Ashton and the Hidden History of Riverstone Plantation. The article caused a sensation in academic circles. It raised questions about what other secrets might be hidden in the archives of American history. It suggested that the official records of slavery, the censuses, the inventories, the legal documents, were incomplete. That there were people who had been deliberately erased from history. That the true story of American slavery was far more complex and disturbing than the official narrative suggested. But the article also raised a more troubling question. How many other Roses were there? How many other people had been hidden away, their existence denied, their humanity erased? How many other secrets were buried in the archives, waiting to be discovered? The answer, historians have come to realize, is that we will never know. The very nature of such secrets means that many of them will never be found. The people who were hidden, the families who hid them, the documents that might have revealed the truth, all of these have been lost to time. What we do know is this: Rose Ashton existed. She was real. She was a person of intelligence, dignity, and remarkable resilience. She survived a system designed to erase her. She claimed her own freedom. She built a life of meaning and purpose. And yet, for the first 22 years of her life, she did not officially exist. She was a ghost in her own family's house. A secret that had to be kept. A problem that had to be managed. The question that haunts us as we contemplate her story is not whether she was real. The documents prove that she was. The question is, what does it mean to be a person in a world that denies your existence? What does it mean to live in the margins, invisible to the official world, yet undeniably present? What does it mean to be loved by people who are simultaneously complicit in your erasure? And perhaps most troublingly, how many other people have lived in that space? How many other ghosts are hidden in the archives of American history, waiting for someone to find them and restore them to the world? The story of Rose Ashton did not end with her death in 1878. In many ways, it only began then. For decades after her death, her story remained largely unknown. The academic article by Margaret Thornton in 1923 brought some attention to it, but it was primarily of interest to scholars and historians. The general public knew nothing of Rose. The world knew nothing of the girl who had been hidden for 43 years. But in the 1960s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, historians began to take renewed interest in the hidden histories of slavery. They began to look more carefully at the archives. They began to ask the questions that had not been asked before. And they began to find stories like Rose's. The story of Rose Ashton became a symbol of something larger. It became a symbol of the ways in which slavery had not only enslaved people but had also erased them. It became a symbol of the ways in which families had conspired to hide the evidence of their own moral failings. It became a symbol of the ways in which the official records of history were incomplete, biased, and deliberately falsified. Scholars began to study the Ashton family papers more carefully. They began to examine the ledgers. They began to read Catherine's journals. And they began to understand the full complexity of what had happened at Riverstone. They understood that Thomas Ashton had not simply hidden Rose out of cruelty. He had hidden her because he was trapped by the system that he had created. He had hidden her because acknowledging her would have meant acknowledging his brother's transgression. It would have meant acknowledging the moral bankruptcy of slavery. It would have meant acknowledging that the system he had built his life upon was fundamentally wrong. They understood that Catherine Ashton had not simply been a passive participant in Rose's erasure. She had been an active participant. She had educated Rose. She had cared for her. She had advocated for her. But she had also been complicit in her erasure. She had been trapped by the system that had defined her role as a wife and a mother. She had been unable to do what was right because doing what was right would have cost her everything. They understood that James Ashton had not simply wanted to sell Rose out of cruelty. He had wanted to remove her because she represented a threat to the order that he believed in. She represented the possibility of a different world. She represented the possibility that the system could be challenged. She represented the possibility that the family's reputation could be destroyed. They understood that William Ashton had not simply freed Rose out of kindness. He had freed her because he had come to believe that slavery was wrong. He had freed her because he had come to understand that his family had participated in a moral evil. He had freed her because he had decided that his reputation was less important than justice. And they understood that Rose herself had not simply been a victim. She had been a survivor. She had been a woman of remarkable intelligence and dignity. She had used her education to understand her own oppression. She had used her freedom to fight for the freedom of others. She had used her life to challenge the system that had tried to erase her. The story of Rose Ashton became a story about the complexity of complicity. It became a story about the ways in which good people could participate in evil. It became a story about the ways in which systems of oppression could corrupt everyone who participated in them, regardless of their intentions. But it also became a story about resistance. It became a story about the ways in which people could challenge the systems that oppressed them. It became a story about the ways in which people could claim their own freedom even in the face of overwhelming odds. It became a story about the ways in which people could insist on their own existence even when the world tried to erase them. But the story of Rose Ashton also raises questions that we still cannot fully answer. The first question is, was Rose truly hidden? Or was she simply one of many people who existed in the margins of slavery, neither fully enslaved nor fully free, documented yet invisible? The historical record suggests that Rose was unusual in the extent to which she was hidden. Most people of mixed race who lived on plantations were either enslaved or freed. They were counted. They were documented. But Rose was something different. She was deliberately erased from the official record. She was documented in secret. She was acknowledged by her family yet denied by the world. But was she unique, or were there others like her? Were there other families who had hidden children? Were there other secrets buried in the archives? The answer is almost certainly yes. There were other families who had hidden children. There were other secrets. But most of them have been lost to time. Most of them have been erased so completely that we will never know they existed. The second question is, why did Thomas Ashton hide Rose? What was his motivation? The most obvious answer is that he was trying to protect his family's reputation. If Rose had been acknowledged, it would have been clear that his brother had fathered a child with an enslaved woman. It would have been clear that the family had participated in the sexual exploitation of enslaved people. It would have been clear that the family was not as respectable as they claimed to be. But there may have been other motivations as well. Perhaps Thomas Ashton felt some sense of responsibility toward Rose. Perhaps he felt that hiding her was a way of protecting her. Perhaps he felt that acknowledging her would have been worse for her than hiding her. We will never know for certain. Thomas Ashton left no explanation for his decision. He left only the evidence of what he had done. The third question is, did Rose ever forgive her family? The historical record suggests that she did not. She never returned to Riverstone. She never reconciled with James. She never publicly acknowledged her connection to the Ashton family except through William's acknowledgement of her. But she also did not seem to harbor bitterness toward William. She accepted his offer of freedom. She accepted his acknowledgement. She seemed to understand that William was trying to do what he believed to be right. As for Catherine, Rose seemed to understand that Catherine had been trapped by the system that had defined her role. Catherine's journals suggest that she loved Rose, that she cared for her, that she wanted to protect her. But she was unable to do what was necessary to truly protect her. She was unable to free her. She was unable to acknowledge her. She was unable to do anything but maintain the secret. The fourth question is, what happened to Lydia, Rose's mother? The historical record is largely silent on this point. Lydia appears in the documents only as the mother of Rose. We do not know what happened to her after Rose was sent away. We do not know if she was freed. We do not know if she was sold. We do not know if she was still alive when William freed Rose. This silence is perhaps the most troubling aspect of the story, because it suggests that Lydia, the woman who gave birth to Rose, who raised her, who loved her, has been erased from history even more completely than Rose herself. We know that Rose existed. We have documents. We have journals. We have evidence. But Lydia has left almost no trace. She is a ghost of a ghost. The fifth question is, what does this story tell us about the nature of slavery? The story of Rose Ashton suggests that slavery was not simply a system of labor exploitation. It was also a system of psychological and social control. It was a system that required the erasure of people's humanity. It was a system that required families to participate in the denial of their own moral agency. The story suggests that slavery corrupted everyone who participated in it. It corrupted the enslavers who had to convince themselves that they were doing what was right. It corrupted the families of the enslavers who had to maintain the fiction that the system was just. It corrupted the society that supported the system, which had to deny the humanity of millions of people in order to justify their exploitation. And the story suggests that resistance to slavery took many forms. It was not simply the dramatic resistance of rebellion or escape. It was also the quiet resistance of people like Catherine who tried to protect those they loved within the constraints of an evil system. It was the resistance of people like William who came to believe that the system itself was wrong and who tried to challenge it. It was the resistance of people like Rose who insisted on their own existence even when the world tried to erase them. The story of Rose Ashton is ultimately a story about the power of documentation. It is a story about the ways in which records can preserve truth even when that truth has been deliberately hidden. It is a story about the ways in which the past can speak to us even across the centuries. Rose Ashton existed. The documents prove it. The ledgers prove it. The journals prove it. The letters prove it. And because of these documents, we know her story. We know that she was real. We know that she mattered. We know that her life had meaning and value. But the story is also a cautionary tale. It is a tale about the ways in which systems of oppression can hide themselves. It is a tale about the ways in which families can conspire to erase the evidence of their own moral failings. It is a tale about the ways in which the official records of history can be incomplete, biased, and deliberately falsified. And it is a tale about the ways in which people can resist. It is a tale about the ways in which people can insist on their own existence even in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a tale about the ways in which people can claim their own freedom, even when the world tries to deny it to them. Rose Ashton was never sold. She was never freed by law until William freed her. She was never acknowledged by her family until William acknowledged her. She was never recognized by the world until historians discovered her story. But she was real. She was a person. She mattered. And her story, preserved in the archives, speaks to us across the centuries. It tells us about the hidden histories of slavery. It tells us about the ways in which families participated in evil. It tells us about the ways in which people resisted. It tells us about the ways in which the past is never truly past but continues to speak to us, demanding that we listen, demanding that we remember, demanding that we do.